You're listening to Audiology. Support our work on Patreon and be sure to submit your requests for topics in the comments below. Let's talk about the Battle of Long Island, also known as the Battle of Brooklyn or the Battle of Brooklyn Heights, which was a significant early battle in the American Revolutionary War. It took place on August 27, 1776, near what's now Brooklyn, New York. The British emerged victorious and took control of the crucial port of New York, which they retained for the duration of the war. This was the first major battle following the United States Declaration of Independence on the 4th of July in Philadelphia, and was the biggest of the entire war in terms of the number of soldiers and the scale of the fighting. George Washington, the commander-in-chief of the Continental Army, had previously defeated the British in the siege of Boston. After that victory, on March 17th, he shifted his focus to New York City, at the tip of Manhattan Island. Washington knew the importance of New York's harbor for the Royal Navy and prepared the city's defenses, expecting a British attack. In July, under General William Howe, the British landed on Staten Island just across the harbor, and over the following 6 weeks they gathered a force of 32,000 troops, thanks to reinforcements brought by ships in lower New York Bay. Recognizing the challenge of defending New York, with the British fleet controlling the harbor entrance known as the Narrows, Washington moved most of his army to Manhattan, believing it to be the British's likely first target. Then, on August 21st, the British forces landed at Gravesend Bay in Kings County, south of the East River crossings leading to Manhattan. The British waited there for 5 days before launching an assault on the American defenses on the Guan Heights. However, the Americans didn't realize that General Howe had managed to bring his main army behind them to attack their flank. This surprise caused panic among the American troops. They suffered heavy losses, with 1 in 5 either killed or captured. Yet, a brave stand by around 400 troops from Maryland and Delaware prevented the losses from being worse. The rest of the American forces pulled back to their main defenses at Brooklyn Heights. The British started a siege, but on the night of August 29th to 30th, Washington masterfully pulled off a retreat to Manhattan, moving his whole army without losing a single life or abandoning their supplies. Unfortunately, the Continental Army was eventually pushed out of Manhattan as well after a series of defeats, and it had to withdraw across New Jersey all the way to Pennsylvania. At the start of the war, British forces were confined to Boston, which is situated on a peninsula. They had to abandon the city on March 17th and set sail for Halifax, Nova Scotia, to await reinforcements. Anticipating a British assault on New York City next, due to its essential port, Washington began relocating his troops there. He had previously dispatched Charles Lee, his trusted deputy, to prepare New York's defenses back in February. Washington left Boston on April 4th, arrived in New York on April 13th, and established his command post at the former residence of Archibald Kennedy on Broadway, directly opposite Bowling Green. Lee remained in New York City until March, but then the Continental Congress required his presence in South Carolina. This responsibility of completing the city's defenses fell to General William Alexander, who is also known as Lord Stirling. With a shortage of troops, the defenses were still incomplete when Washington arrived. Nonetheless, Lee had surmised that even with robust defenses, defending the city would be futile if the British controlled the seas. His tactic was to craft the defenses to inflict substantial casualties on the British should they attempt to seize the land. They erected barricades and defensive structures in and around the city. Notably, one such fortification, Fort Sterling, was established on Brooklyn Heights, directly across the river from the city. Furthermore, Lee took precautionary measures to expel any loyalists from the vicinity. In May, Washington began sending thousands of troops to Brooklyn. They rapidly constructed 3 forts, Fort Putnam, Fort Greene, and Fort Box, near the existing Fort Sterling, all of which were designed to aid in the defense of the area. Fort Defiance was also being erected near Red Hook. They established a series of fortifications, including deep trenches, a line of 36 cannons, and the sinking of old ships in the water to obstruct British access via the East River. They even positioned additional cannons in strategic locations around Manhattan and Governor's Island. Even though Congress had authorized an army size of 28,501 soldiers, Washington was only able to muster 19,000. Discipline presented a major problem. Soldiers disregarded orders, misused equipment, and there was significant quarreling due to the diverse mix of individuals from various backgrounds. Artillery officer Henry Knox persuaded Washington to reassign 400 to 500 unarmed men to handle the cannons. In June, Knox, along with General Nathaniel Greene, surveyed the northern part of Manhattan and selected a location for Fort Washington. Across the river, they planned for Fort Constitution, later renamed Fort Lee, as part of a strategic approach to prevent British ships from moving up the Hudson. On June 28th, General Washington got word that the British fleet had left Halifax on June 9th, setting a course for New York. The following day, signals from Staten Island let everyone know the British ships had been spotted. Soon after, 45 of those ships dropped anchor in lower New York Bay, sending New York's residents into a state of panic. People were alarmed, and soldiers swiftly took to their defense positions. By July 2nd, British forces started to land on Staten Island. The Continental soldiers there took some shots before retreating, and local militia switched allegiance to the British. In less than a week, the British forces swelled to 130 ships with Richard Howe in command. He was General Howe's brother. On July 6th, New York received news that 4 days prior, Congress had voted for independence. On July 9th at 6 p.m., Washington gathered his troops to publicly read the Declaration of Independence. After hearing it, a mob expressed their anger by destroying a statue of King George III in Bowling Green. They beheaded the statue, hacked off its nose, paraded the head on a spike, and melted down the rest in Connecticut to make musket balls. On July 12th, the British ships Phoenix and Rose navigated New York Harbor toward the Hudson River. American forces fired at them from their fortifications, but the British fired back into the city. The ships traveled up the Hudson, going as far as Tarrytown by dusk. Their mission was to cut American supply lines and win over Loyalist support. The clash resulted in 6 American casualties from a cannon explosion. The next day, July 13th, Howe sought to start peace talks. He sent a letter to Washington, which deliberately omitted Washington's military title. After discussing with his officers, Washington chose not to accept the letter. Howe tried to send another letter on July 16th, this time with a vague title, but it was also rejected. A personal meeting was set up for July 20th, where Washington famously said, "Those who have committed no fault want no pardon," in response to talks of pardons. Washington was later commended for his conduct in that meeting. The British continued to strengthen their presence. On August 1st, 45 more ships arrived with Generals Henry Clinton and Charles Cornwallis, along with additional troops. By August 12th, the British forces had grown substantially, with over 400 ships and 32,000 troops on Staten Island. Facing this large force, Washington wasn't certain about where they would strike next. His advisors thought Long Island might be the target, but Washington worried it could be a distraction from a larger attack on Manhattan. He divided his army between the 2 locations, with half on Manhattan and the other half on Long Island, initially under the command of Greene. However, Greene fell ill on August 20th and had to step down temporarily, with John Sullivan taking over until Greene could command again. Early in the morning of August 22nd, at precisely 5:10 a.m., a force of 4,000 British soldiers, spearheaded by Generals Clinton and Cornwallis, embarked from Staten Island. Just before 8 a.m., they successfully landed on Long Island without opposition at Gravesend Bay. Colonel Edward Hand's group of Pennsylvanian riflemen, who were stationed on the shoreline, chose not to confront the British and instead retreated. As they withdrew, they disrupted the area by slaughtering livestock and setting fire to farmhouses. By the time noon arrived, the British had amassed 15,000 soldiers and 40 artillery units on the beach. Many loyalties came forward to welcome these British forces. General Cornwallis pressed on with his lead group, moving 6 miles inland to set up camp at Flatbush Village, as instructed not to proceed any further. On that same day, George Washington was alerted to the British landing, though he was incorrectly informed that their numbers ranged between 8,000 and 9,000. This led Washington to believe that this was just a distraction, a feint, as he had previously suspected, and thus he only reinforced Brooklyn with an additional 1,500 troops, bringing the American force on Long Island to 6,000 men. 2 days later, on August 24th, Washington appointed General Israel Putnam to take over command from Sullivan on Long Island. Putnam and 6 battalions arrived the following day. That same day, the British forces on the island were bolstered with an extra 5,000 Hessian troops, increasing their total size to 20,000 soldiers. Despite the large numbers, there wasn't much fighting in the days immediately following the landing, though there were some minor clashes. American snipers, equipped with rifles, occasionally succeeded in taking down British soldiers. The American strategy laid out by Washington involved General Putnam orchestrating the defenses from Brooklyn Heights, while Generals Sullivan and Sterling would command their forces from the Guan Heights, which are up to 150 feet tall and presented a barrier to the direct path to Brooklyn Heights. Washington thought the high ground would be key for inflicting heavy losses on the British before retreating back to the main defensive line at Brooklyn Heights. There were three major paths through these heights: the Gowanus Road to the west, the Flatbush Road in the centre, and the Bedford Pass further east. Stirling was tasked with defending Gowanus Road with 500 of his men, while Sullivan was in charge of guarding the Flatbush and Bedford Roads with 1,800 men respectively. The remainder of the troops, 6,000 of them, stayed behind at Brooklyn Heights. There was also a less-known path, the Jamaica Pass, situated furthest to the east and minimally guarded by just 5 militia officers on horseback. On the British side, General Clinton had received intelligence about the lightly defended Jamaica Pass from local loyalists. He came up with an attack plan, which was delivered to William Erskine to propose to General Howe. According to Clinton's plan, the primary British forces, numbering 10,000, would secretly move through the Jamaica Pass at night to outmaneuver the Americans, while other British divisions, including General James Grant's 4,000 men supplemented by Hessians, would engage the Americans from the front to divert their attention. On August 26th, Clinton was informed by General Howe to get ready to execute this plan that very night. At 9 p.m., the British troops secretly began to move out. The commanders were the only ones aware of the plan. Leading the way was General Clinton with a specialized group of light infantry, their bayonets ready for combat. He was followed by General Cornwallis, who commanded 8 battalions and was in charge of 14 pieces of heavy artillery. Behind them marched General Howe and Hugh Percy, with 6 battalions, additional artillery, and their supplies. The force was immense, 10,000 strong and spanning a distance of 2 miles. Guided by 3 farmers who were loyal to the Crown, the British kept their campfires burning back at their camp as a ruse to trick the Americans into thinking all was normal. Their route took them first northeast until they reached the area that would one day be known as the village of New Lots. From there, they turned north, making their way toward the high ground. The British force encountered no American soldiers until they came upon Howard's Tavern, which was near the Jamaica Pass. The tavern's owner, William Howard, and his son were taken by British soldiers and ordered to guide them. William Howard Jr. later gave an account of that night, recalling the moment a soldier woke him up at around 2 a.m. Descending to the barroom, he found his father cornered by British troops. General Howe, who was present and cloaked over his uniform, casually asked for a drink before demanding the Howards guide his men. When William Howard Sr. expressed reluctance to aid the enemy, General Howe sternly made it clear that they had no choice, threatening to shoot him if he refused. Just 5 minutes after leaving the tavern, the British easily captured the 5 American militia officers stationed at the pass, as they mistakenly identified the British troops as fellow Americans. Clinton questioned these men and realized they were the only ones guarding the pass. With the pass undefended, the British made their way through and rested as dawn broke. At 9 a.m., a signal was given by firing 2 heavy cannons, instructing the nearby Hessian forces to attack from the front. This was part of a coordinated effort with Clinton's troops, who were now positioned to outflank the Americans from the east. Around 11 at night on August 26th, near a place called the Red Lion Inn, which is now around 39th Street and 4th Avenue, the Battle of Long Island began with the first shots being fired. American soldiers from Samuel John Attlee's Pennsylvania Regiment shot at 2 British soldiers who were in a watermelon patch near the inn. A few hours later, at 1 in the morning on August 27th, a British force of about 200 to 300 men got close to the Red Lion. The Americans fired on them. After they exchanged gunfire twice, the American troops ran off, headed toward the Vecticotelu house on Gowanus Road. Major Edward Byrd, who was in charge, got captured along with some of his men. Brigadier General Samuel Holden Parsons and Colonel Attlee were on Gowanus Road, but further north. Parsons, a lawyer from Connecticut who had joined the Continental Army not long ago, and Attlee, a seasoned soldier from the French and Indian War, were in positions to act. General Putnam, who was also there, was woken up at 3 a.m. by a guard telling him that the British were coming through Gowanus Pass. He quickly signaled General Washington on Manhattan and then rode south to alert Stirling about the attack. Stirling commanded around 1,600 men, including Delaware troops under Major Thomas McDonough and Maryland soldiers under Major Mordecai Geist, both of whom's commanders were away on duty in Manhattan. Parsons's Connecticut regiment was also there, with 251 soldiers. Stirling's goal was to reinforce Parsons and Attlee and halt the British. Stirling arranged Attlee's soldiers in an apple orchard on the south side of Gowanus Road, near where 3rd Avenue and 18th Street are now. When the British approached, the Americans took a hill about 2 miles from their camp, and Attlee met the British further down the road. After an exchange of fire, the Americans pulled back to the hill. General Parsons described how Attlee's regiment fired on the British, causing significant casualties before retreating to the hill. Sterling positioned other troops just north of Atlee, on the slopes between 18th and 20th Streets. Some Maryland forces were on a small hill the local Dutch called Blokjeberg, near today's 23rd Street. There was a bridge at the base of this hill, crossing a ditch by the Gowanus Road. The American troops shot at the British from the north side of this ditch, and to their left was Colonel Peter Cackleen's regiment. Close to Blokjeberg there were a few hills, including one named Battle Hill, the highest in Kings County at 220 feet. It's now in what's called Greenwood Cemetery. The British tried to go around the American positions by taking this hill. The Americans, led by Parsons and Atlee, rushed to beat them to it. Even though the British got there first, the Americans pushed them off after some intense combat. Battle Hill witnessed some of the harshest fighting of the whole battle, with the Americans dealing the British their worst casualties. One of those killed was a British colonel, James Grant. The Americans mistakenly thought they had taken down General James Grant because a sharpshooter from Pennsylvania reportedly shot him from a tree. An American colonel, Caleb Parry, also died there while urging his men on. Despite the fierce combat, the Americans didn't realize this wasn't the primary British attack, in part because the fighting was so intense and they were up against such a large number of British troops. In the heart of the battlefield, General von Heister commanded the Hessians as they unleashed a heavy bombardment on the American troops, who were dug in at Battle Pass with General John Sullivan at the helm. The Hessians held back from a full-on assault as they were waiting for a cue from the British forces, who were secretly moving to outmaneuver the Americans from behind. Meanwhile, the American forces mistakenly believed that the main point of attack was Grant's advance along the Gowanus Road, leading Sullivan to send 400 reinforcements to support Sterling. Then, at 9 a.m., Howe set off the agreed-upon signal with his guns, prompting the Hessians to mount their assault on Battle Pass at the same time as the British main army attacked Sullivan from the rear. Sullivan directed his frontline troops to delay the Hessians, while he pivoted his main force to confront the British attackers. Amid the fierce battle, heavy losses racked up on both sides, and fear drove some men to flee. Trying desperately to keep a handle on the situation, Sullivan worked to soothe his troops and managed to start pulling them back. But by then, the Hessians had taken control of the heights, and the American left flank was in shambles. This led to intense close-quarters combat, where Americans were forced to fight for their lives using their muskets and rifles as bludgeons. Reports later surfaced that Hessians bayoneted some of the Americans, even after they had surrendered. Amidst the turmoil, Sullivan remarkably managed to lead most of his troops back to the safety of Brooklyn Heights. However, he wasn't so fortunate himself, as he ended up being captured. At 9 o'clock in the morning, George Washington arrived from Manhattan and realized his mistake about a false attack on Long Island. He quickly sent more troops over to Brooklyn. It's not certain where he was exactly during the battle, since reports vary, but he was likely at Brooklyn Heights, which gave him a good view of the action. General Sterling was on the American right flank, holding off the British under General Grant's command. His men fought hard for 4 hours, and because they were unaware of the British moving around their flank, some thought they were actually winning. But by 11 a.m., Grant got backup from 2,000 Marines and focused his attack in the middle of Sterling's lines. The situation worsened for Sterling's men as the Hessians assaulted them from the side. As British forces pressed from behind on the Gowanus Road, Sterling's only choice was to retreat across the 80-yard-wide Brower's Mill Pond on Gowanus Creek towards the American defense at Brooklyn Heights. The Maryland 400, as they came to be known, though their numbers were closer to 260 or 270, were commanded to stay and cover the retreat by Sterling and their commander, Geest. They famously fought against more than 2,000 British soldiers and their cannons in a counterattack. Sterling and Geest led the Maryland troops in 2 charges near the Vecte Cortelyou House, also known as the Old Stone House. Following their final attack, the survivors fled across the Gowanus Creek. Some soldiers got stuck in the swampy land, and others, who were unable to swim, were captured. Sterling himself was cornered and chose to surrender to the Hessians rather than the British. In the end, 256 Maryland soldiers died in the battle near the Old Stone House, and fewer than 12 made it back to safety. Washington, observing from Cobble Hill, where Court Street meets Atlantic Avenue today, was moved by their bravery, and is quoted as saying, "Good God, what brave fellows I must this day lose." When the Continental Army found themselves under attack, those who were not killed or taken prisoner managed to retreat to a fortified spot at Brooklyn Heights. However, instead of pushing forward, General Howe ordered his troops to stop their assault. This order came despite other officers urging to continue the attack towards Brooklyn Heights. General Howe preferred to lay siege, circling the American troops with barriers over a direct attack. He figured the Americans were cornered, with his forces blocking any land escape and the British Navy controlling the East River to Manhattan. People have questioned why Howe didn't keep up the attack. Some think he wanted to avoid the heavy losses his army suffered in an earlier battle at Bunker Hill. Others speculate he was trying to give George Washington, the American commander, a feeling of hopelessness, leading to a surrender as was customary among European gentlemen officers. Howe explained himself to the British Parliament in 1779. He said his main responsibility was to avoid risking too many British lives for too small a gain. Capturing Brooklyn Heights wouldn't necessarily mean capturing the whole American army. He said, "The most essential duty I had to observe was not to wantonly commit His Majesty's troops where the object was inadequate. I knew well that any considerable loss sustained by the army could not speedily nor easily be repaired. The loss of 1,000 or perhaps 1,500 British troops in carrying those lines would have been but ill repaid by double that number of the enemy. Could it have been supposed they would have suffered in that proportion?" During the Revolutionary War, General George Washington and his Continental Army found themselves in a difficult position at Brooklyn Heights, confined with the East River directly behind them. All through the day, the British troops were fortifying their position, digging trenches that brought them nearer and nearer to the American fortifications. This tactic would prevent them from having to cross open ground as they had done before in Boston. Despite the precarious situation, Washington called for an additional 1,200 soldiers from Manhattan on August 28th. In response to the call, 2 regiments from Pennsylvania and Colonel John Glover's unit from Marblehead, Massachusetts, provided assistance. Once they had arrived, Thomas Mifflin, who commanded the Pennsylvania troops, promptly conducted a review of the outer defenses to update Washington. Meanwhile, American and British forces continued to skirmish. On the afternoon of August 28th, as rain began to fall, Washington commanded a cannon bombardment against the British that continued into the night. In the midst of the rainfall, Washington wrote to General William Heath, who was stationed at King's Bridge, that's over the Harlem River, between what is now Manhattan and the Bronx, and he asked for the immediate sending of every flat-bottomed boat and slop in anticipation of more forces from New Jersey. On August 29th at 4 in the afternoon, Washington met with his generals, and Mifflin proposed a strategic withdrawal to Manhattan. Mifflin and his men would act as the rear guard to protect the retreat. The generals unanimously decided that retreating was indeed the best option, and by evening, Washington had the retreat orders distributed. Instructions were given to the soldiers to pack up all their equipment and gear, as they were led to believe a nighttime attack was imminent. By 9 o'clock at night, the evacuation commenced with the movement of the injured and ill to the Brooklyn ferry. At 11 o'clock at night, Glover's men, experienced sailors and fishermen, started transporting troops across the river. As the evacuation proceeded, further orders were given for more soldiers to vacate their positions and make their way to the ferry. Quietness was critical. The noise from wagon wheels was muffled, and speaking was banned. Mifflin and his rear guard maintained campfires burning to deceive the British into thinking they were still there. By 4 o'clock in the morning on August 30th, it was time for Mifflin's turn to depart. Despite initially resisting the order from Major Alexander Scammell, Mifflin finally instructed his troops to move toward the ferry. Not long after, Washington appeared unexpectedly to find Mifflin's men missing from their posts. Mifflin clarified the miscommunication about the evacuation order to Washington. With reluctance, Washington accepted the explanation, and Mifflin speedily led his troops back to their defensive spots. As soldiers, artillery, and provisions continued their transit across the river, the process was slower than Washington had expected. But as dawn neared, a thick fog set in, hiding the remaining evacuees from the British view. Eventually, British patrols realized the American sentries were gone and began searching. During this critical period, Washington himself boarded the final boat. By 7 in the morning, the last of the American troops had safely reached Manhattan. Astonishingly, all 9,000 soldiers were evacuated without a single life lost. The British could hardly believe it when they realized that Washington and his Continental Army had managed to slip away. Later, on August 30th, they marched in and took over the very same spots Washington and his troops had just vacated. Back in London, the victory sparked quite the celebration. Bells rang out, people put candles in their windows, and King George III even honored General Howe with a prestigious award known as the Order of the Bath. Some folks looked at what happened and thought less of Washington as a military leader. They said his decision to split up his army was a bad one, and it led to confusion among his inexperienced generals, not to mention his troops were scared off by the first shots fired. But there's another side to the story, with some historians praising Washington's sneaky nighttime retreat as one of his most impressive moves. Even after this, General Howe didn't press his advantage for a couple of weeks. It wasn't until September 15th that he finally made his move and landed troops at Kipps Bay, quickly taking control of the city. While the American forces did manage to surprise the British at Harlem Heights mid-September, Howe went on to defeat Washington again at White Plains and then at Fort Washington. Following these losses, Washington knew he was beaten and pulled back his army all the way to Pennsylvania. On top of that, a large fire, with origins no one could pin down, took out a huge part of New York City on September 21st. Soon after, the American spy Nathan Hale was caught and executed. At that time, this was the biggest battle ever seen in North America, with over 40,000 troops if you include the Royal Navy. Howe reported that he lost 59 men, with another 268 wounded and 31 missing. The Hessians, who were allied with the British, had fewer casualties, 5 dead and 26 injured. The Americans were hit much harder, though. About 300 were killed and more than 1,000 taken prisoner. Sadly, most of the captured didn't survive the horrendous conditions on prison ships and in places like the Middle Dutch Church. Without proper food or health care and weakened by illness, many died from smallpox. Historians think that up to 256 soldiers from the 1st Maryland Regiment, led by Colonel William Smallwood, died in that battle, which was roughly 2/3 of his men. They were buried in a mass grave for 240 years. No one has known exactly where that grave is. The Battle of Long Island left a lasting impression, revealing that the fight for victory would be long and brutal. The British gained control of the crucial New York harbor, and New York City was under their control until the end of the war. With the British military based there, New York City turned into a hotbed for spying and intelligence efforts. Meanwhile, the areas around the city and harbor experienced relentless skirmishes as a forage war plagued the local communities. Now, let's talk about how we remember this battle. First up is the Altar to Liberty, Minerva Monument, featuring a bronze statue of Minerva that you can find at Battle Hill in Brooklyn's Greenwood Cemetery. The statue, created by sculptor Frederick Ruxtell and revealed in 1920, has Minerva looking right at the Statue of Liberty from her position in the cemetery. Minerva became an icon of preservation. When, in 2006, she was cited as a reason to stop a building from obstructing the view between the cemetery and the Statue of Liberty. Every year, there's a commemorative walk that starts at Greenwood Cemetery's main entrance and goes up to the monument for a ceremony. The prison ship martyrs monument stands tall in Fort Greene as a Doric column, honoring those who died on British prison ships off Brooklyn's coast. Over in Milford, Connecticut, the Soldiers' Monument is a tribute to the 200 ill prisoners from the battle who were left on a beach on January 3, 1777. The Old Stone House is a key historic site related to the battle. This reconstructed farmhouse has been turned into a museum showcasing models and maps of the battle. It's right there in Brooklyn's J.J. Byrne Park. Then there's Prospect Park, where you'll find a big granite boulder and a brass plaque for Battle Pass, as well as a marker by the road where the Dongan Oak once stood, a huge tree chopped down to block the British. There are also markers recognizing the defense lines and the Maryland troops who fought valiantly in the battle. Lastly, let's not forget that there are 30 U.S. Army units still around today, with ties back to the Revolutionary times. Among those, 5 Army National Guard units and 1 regular Army Field Artillery Battalion have routes that reach all the way back to the Battle of Long Island. Thanks for watching. Share your thoughts in the comments and subscribe for more content.